The Bombshell by Darrow Farr. A woman lays claim to as many native lands as she has had happy loves. Colette, Break of Day. Ajaccio, 1993. Chapter 1. Enlèvement. In the hours before her kidnapping, Séverine Guimard claimed Antoine Carcenti's virginity in a grotto overlooking the Mediterranean Sea. She'd felt his eyes on her since she transferred to the Lycée Laetitia Bonaparte the year before. She knew she wasn't beautiful in the dark-haired, olive-skinned way of the Corsicans around her, but Séverine was something to look at, with her sharp cheekbones and gold-washed hair and huge nose. It was a nose that belonged on the marble bust of a Roman senator, not a 17-year-old girl. Her mother always told her she'd look common without it, but Séverine had convinced Papa to pay for a nose job as a combination graduation birthday gift, so long as she passed the baccalaureate next week. It was perhaps this one flaw that endowed her with a keen awareness of her body, how it moved beneath clothes, how to angle her face in overhead lighting, how to make people watch her. Admittedly, she also possessed a certain magnetism based on her father's position as prefect of Corsica. She'd been to the Elysée for dinner, and President Schneider had kissed her hello. She'd vacationed in Greece with the head of the IMF and his family. She'd even played pétanque with a mid-succession line Grimaldi on the beach in Monaco one time. But she did not feel like Papa's position and influence eclipsed her infant star. In fact, she was confident that she'd eventually burn brighter than him. She would be an actress, a very famous one whose poster teen boys would tack to their ceilings, once she had her nose fixed. Séverine loved how Antoine Carcenti already gawked at her like she was somebody. She'd asked to borrow a pen, and he'd hand it to her while thanking her for asking him. Last year, he was all baby fat and a bad crew cut, but he'd since shot up and slimmed down, let his hair grow out, and parted it down the middle like Leonardo DiCaprio on Quoi de neuf, Docteur? He wasn't hot yet, but in another year or two he would be. It was the ideal moment for Séverine to initiate him, before he was corrupted by his new status, when he was still sweet and grateful for her attention. Seeking a break from all the frantic, last-minute test prep, she had invited Antoine for a beer at the Paillote by her house. He was incapable of playing it cool, twisting his cocktail napkin into shreds and asking her dull questions. Do you like it better here or in Paris? Paris, obviously. I mean, the beach is nice, but otherwise it's so boring. Anyway, I'm going back. Well, as long as I pass the bac. I'm starting at Paris 3 this fall. God, I hope drama school is less of a drag than lycée. She took an anxious drink, thinking about the impending exam, which determined whether they'd be going to university or held back for another year of terminale. Although she'd argued in favor of skipping university and going straight to LA, a hard no from her parents, the thought of failing the bac, of her parents' disappointment and embarrassment, of confirming she was a total bimbo airhead, made her want to bury herself alive in the sand. My parents think I should get a good education first, Séverine continued with a sigh. It's annoying, but I guess Hollywood is impressed by Shakespeare in the Park types. She didn't expect Antoine to know what Shakespeare in the Park was, and that was the point of name-dropping it. Séverine was worldly, with a French politician father and American poet mother. What about you? Where are you headed? She asked. I guess l'Université de Corse? Are you going to become radicalized there? She teased. Join I Fratelli? Write nasty things about my father in the student paper and start thinking of me as a dirty colonizing Pinzutu? Antoine let out a soft laugh. All that pro-independence stuff is pretty lame. Besides, I'm not that into politics. All Corsicans are into politics, she said. You can be honest. What do you think of my dad? Hesitating, he said, My parents say it's good he's pushing for autonomy, but it's probably a way to pretend he's fighting for us without changing much. He winced, afraid he'd blown it by telling the truth. I get it, Séverine said diplomatically, although Antoine's parents were clearly idiots. But it's only been a year. He's got a lot of ideas. He really wanted the job. Believe me, my mom and I did everything possible to make him turn it down. For a moment, she felt silly articulating this resentment while chewing on a mint leaf fished from her mojito, feet sunk into fine sand that led to the tourmaline blue sea. Corsica was dead half the year, but now, at the beginning of summer, the island came alive. Droves of people traveled from the continent on vacation. The sun emitted powerful golden light well into the evening, and nights were warm as bathwater, made for drinking cold wine. It finally blossomed into the Ile de Beauté the postcards promised, where something exciting might happen for once. "I guess I'll miss some things about this place," she added with affected wistfulness, gazing towards the water. Then she turned, locking eyes with him. "I'll miss you, for one." They got a little drunk and walked along the beach as the sun extinguished itself in the ocean. When they reached a tiny cove between the cliffs, Séverine leaned against the rock and pushed her hair out of her face. "Come here," she said. "What?" Antoine asked, like a dunce. Séverine placed his hand on her face and took his thumb in her mouth, biting gently. As she closed the distance between them, he leaned away, but once she touched her lips to his, he returned her kiss frantically. She did her best to control the inept speed and pressure of his tongue. It wasn't that pleasant, but this was the deal. She had to be patient, as she trained him to do exactly what she liked. After a few minutes, he pulled back, flushed and shuddery, and said, "You're the most beautiful girl I've ever seen." Séverine knew this was objectively untrue, but understood the gist. He felt both blessed and bewildered, unsure how to express or even identify this chaos of emotion. Séverine found it cute. She had chosen him for this gentle, simple nature. She wanted a guy who'd be properly appreciative. His dumb disbelief that she was in his arms, the trembly panic, that's what turned her on. She'd been with boys who were good-looking and knew it, or worse, mediocre boys with an overabundance of confidence, and she'd learned her lesson. These entitled types abounded in Paris, while the Corsican guys in school harassed her out of some insecurity that she thought she was better than them, which was absolutely correct. She knew she was better than them. Now she only kissed boys like Antoine, quiet, decent, and boring, but on the cusp of a change. She'd guided him onto his back in the sand. "Is this your first time?" she asked, hovering over him. Disoriented, open-mouthed, he nodded. So far, she'd taken the virginities of 4 boys. Antoine made 5. She liked the idea of being never forgotten, a landmark. She liked the feverish tremors they emitted when she ignored them in the hallway afterwards. Funny enough, her virgins never told people at school what transpired. They had their own private experience of Séverine, what they considered the real her, she guessed, and protected it with a touching, misguided loyalty. In reality, they weren't closer to knowing her than anyone else. She pulled her red dress over her head and untied her bikini bottom, watching Antoine watch her with suspicious anticipation, like she might be pranking him. Once he was inside her, though, his demeanor turned solemn, verging on spiritual. Sex itself wasn't yet so satisfying for Séverine. She'd read in her mother's American Cosmo that women don't reach their sexual peaks until their 40s, and internalized this fact with patient expectation. Pleasure wasn't the point here. The pleasure of the boy's devotion was. Besides, she had her trusty electric toothbrush she pressed between her legs when she couldn't fall asleep. She was on the pill, so it didn't concern her when Antoine came without warning, his eyes wide, witnessing some miracle invisible to her. Afterwards, she rolled off him and crouched in the surf to rinse off. It was a relief to be alone in the water. That was the only thing about the virgins. They were like mortals, and she was a god condescending to them. If pleasure wasn't the point, neither was mutual connection, but there was still a small part of her that thought of this ritual as a search for her diamond in the rough. A good guy who contained something interesting that she could excavate and shape, who might inspire her to be at least partially as devoted as he was. Antoine approached, his feet sloshing annoyingly in the waves. She felt him lift her hair out of the water, twirling it around his hand. The gesture was overly intimate, and Séverine's throat burned with embarrassment for him. She jerked her head, and he let go. His adoration, although the objective, was also off-putting. He slid his hands in his pockets, as if he were content to stand staring at her until she instructed otherwise. Sex, such a simple but effective power. Séverine refused Antoine's offer to walk her home and left him on the beach, watching the sunset and taking stock of his new manhood. The bike ride home was uphill and brutal, and Séverine arrived at the neighborhood gate sweaty and breathing through her mouth. A vision of poise and class, JF, the night guard, teased. He sat inside the guardhouse with the door open and a small fan whirring directly on his face. "If you tried riding up that hill, you'd drop dead," she panted, casting her eyes at his gut. By the time she arrived at the villa, modeled after a Corsican bergerie where they traditionally kept sheep, with chunky sand-colored stones and a red clay tile roof, it was dark enough that she could see her parents through the living room window. They sat in matching oxblood leather armchairs, reading by the light of a large arc lamp. Her mother flipped through one of her women's magazines imported from the States, a guilty pleasure. Her father, some hefty book about World War II. At 52, he was still so handsome, at once boyish and important-looking, with silver-streaked hair worn a tad long. Unthreateningly confident, a generous winker and master of reassurance, Paul Guimard had entered politics because what else could he possibly do with a personality, a smile, eyes as blue as that? Be a movie star, but he was unfortunately civic-minded. He continued to believe reasonable progress could be made by showing people that what they wanted, big picture, was more or less what their opponents wanted too. This optimism, plus his ability and willingness to gab with anyone, earned him the prefecture appointment. Séverine resented him for dragging them to this backwater, but it was a resentment tempered by enormous pride. He was destined for greatness, and that meant greatness was Séverine's inheritance too. Through the window, Séverine watched her father reach over and rub her mother's earlobe between his fingers, while they both continued reading. Every innocuous gesture was imbued with affection. Because of her parents, Séverine understood love to be the harmony of small pleasures and large ambitions. They were formidable figures in their respective fields of politics and literature, and viewed each other's successes as a boon to their own careers. So far, that had proven to be correct. Sometimes this made Séverine feel like the third wheel in their marriage. They were so synced, so alike, and parts of her personality were alien to them. They couldn't fathom how she was so hopeless at school, or where these frivolous interests of hers, celebrities, TV, clothes, clubbing, came from. At best, her parents were entertained by her, marveling at how they'd created this person who was charming and outgoing like them, but also vastly different. Lately, however, she exasperated them, and they exasperated her with their infuriating contention that they knew what was best for her future. She ditched her bike on the front lawn and crept to the big picture window, leaping up and smacking her hands against the glass. Both parents jumped at its violent rattling, and her mother yelled in English, "You better get a rag and wipe those handprints. Maria just cleaned." Ignoring her, Séverine went to the L-shaped pool behind the house. All the garden lamps had been turned off except those within the pool, and a nimbus of turquoise light hovered over the wobbling water. She pulled the sandy dress over her head and eased down 2 steps before gliding into the shallow end like a seal. The salt of her sweat and Antoine's dissolved away. Her mother slid open the glass door that led from the kitchen to the back patio, and Séverine could feel the air conditioning emanating out. "I'm serious," her mother said. "I'll do it tomorrow," Séverine replied, spinning to float on her back. The two of them always spoke English, French when her father was present, a mixture of both if she was fighting with them. Her mother was wearing her wire-frame reading glasses and blue-striped pajama shirt. Perhaps not the ideal politician's wife. Not the lacquered, ever-smiling, inoffensive beauties she was so often seated beside at dinners. But Bonnie Guimard possessed her own austere allure. She exuded a kind of severe intellectualism, informed by the esoteric prose poems she published in Anglophone literary magazines, underscored by a healthfulness that verged on sensuality. More handsome than beautiful, she was straight-backed and immovable-looking. She shared button-down shirts with her husband, swam every morning, and ate black bread standing at the kitchen counter as her wet hair stiffened in the air conditioning. Séverine admired her mother, but wanted to be nothing like her in these regards. "What about studying?" "Done." "Are you sure? The tutor says you're still shaky on the philosophy questions." Maybe you can read Tocqueville for 13 hours a day, but I'm done, Séverine snapped. You're the one who's desperate to leave Corsica, her mother said. Passing the back is your ticket out, remember that. She closed the sliding glass door before Séverine could have the last word. Séverine swam 2 laps fuming, fantasizing about hitchhiking to the airport and getting on the next plane to Paris. Then she hoisted herself out of the deep end, pausing with her arms taut, examining her breasts and imagining herself on the cover of a men's magazine. If by some miracle she did pass the back, 4 more years of school would be such a waste of time. She wished her mom could see that. Alas, she'd be mortified to tell her well-credentialed friends that Séverine was skipping university. Nothing was more important to her than these symbols of academic success. In her mind, that's what made a woman worthy of attention. But Séverine knew better. If you were pretty and magnetic, you didn't need to be brilliant. Bonnie had worked with what she was given, and Séverine would do the same. After wringing her hair out onto the cement, she dashed through the frigid kitchen and down the hall to her bedroom. Although they lived in Corsica for a year, Severine's room still looked semi-occupied. White walls except for a Counting Crows poster and the print of Van Gogh's The Bedroom that had hung in her nursery. Her old bedroom in Paris had been plastered in photographs of her friends and layers of posters that thickened with each new celebrity crush. She'd assumed she'd make new friends to take Polaroids with, collect new totems of her new life in this new room. But the girls in Ajaccio were wary of outsiders, like everyone in Corsica, and Severine's social tactics didn't help. She figured that as the new girl, her best bet was to cultivate mystery through aloofness. She expected them to find her intriguing and exotic, to shyly seek her friendship, and she'd open herself to them little by little until they couldn't remember what days at Laetitia Bonaparte had been like without her. What actually happened is they pegged the girl from Paris with a huge nose as an equally huge bitch. When the girls failed to approach Séverine, she reasoned that they were too provincial to recognize her appeal, and told herself that she was better off alone. After showering in her ensuite bathroom and changing into a dry dress, Séverine made to once again slip out the kitchen door. "Where are you off to now?" her father called from the living room. "Bike ride," she replied in French. "Shouldn't you be studying?" he asked, appearing at the kitchen entrance with his big book tucked under one arm. "Exercise helps blood flow to the brain." Séverine flashed her best smile, knowing how to work him. Her father moved towards her, placing a heavy hand on her head and caressing the hair along the side of her face. "Take your helmet and don't be too late," he said, and angled his cheek for a kiss, which she obliged. She would, however, leave the helmet on its hook. Feeling the wind whip her hair back was the best part. Since spring, Séverine had been riding her bike in circles around the neighborhood, listening to tapes on her Walkman and smoking cigarettes. Her mother, being more American than she'd copped to, found cigarettes revolting and forbade her from smoking. Séverine had been caught only once, shortly after they'd moved to Ajaccio. She'd taken to smoking crouched among the foliage behind the house, looking at the sea, until she accidentally set some of the dry scrub on fire, which she, her screaming mother, and their housekeeper Maria put out with saucepans of pool water. Naturally, a rumor spread around the neighborhood that it had been an E. Fratelli plot against her father. So now, under the guise of a healthy nightly bike ride, she cruised around to Tracy Chapman or R.E.M., imagining herself in a music video, and smoked one thin Vogue Lilas. When the cassette ended, she'd return the bike to the shed, dizzy from nicotine and wind. It was quaint compared to how she got her kicks in Paris, drinking vodka orange juice at Pilar or Helene's, more likely Pilar's because her parents were always traveling and didn't notice when a bottle of Absolute mysteriously disappeared. Applying makeup in front of Pilar's full-length mirror before trying and failing to get into Les Bains Douche, then ending up dancing with all the other lycéennes at Le Vinyl. The night was balmy and the insects shrill. Séverine rode through the neighborhood and past JF, who was watching a football match on a handheld TV and eating a kebab, too occupied to notice her leave. She turned onto the road that led down to the beach, the moonlight glinting knife-like along the waves. She stopped to extract the cigarettes and matches from her pocket. A car crept past as she lit up. Its ruby taillights floated down the pitch-dark street towards the beach, then stopped a few blocks away. Undoubtedly, it was a couple taking a moment to kiss in front of the view, she thought wistfully. She'd chosen the What Is Love cassette single as her soundtrack tonight. There was something both urgent and melancholy about the synths that gave her a fluttery, longing feeling. She imagined a stranger approaching from across a smoky dance floor, his motion slashed by strobe lights, pressing a pill onto her tongue. She balanced the cigarette between her lips, pressed play, and pushed off, gaining speed as she coasted down the hill, feeling like a bird flying towards the water. In the instant she reached the idling car, the passenger door flew open and a man jumped out, grabbing the back of Severine's dress and tearing her from her bike. It felt like being swallowed backwards into a black hole, overpowering, confusing, terrifying. The bike continued a few meters like it was running for help before careening on its side and skidding into the bushes. Severine's head knocked against the man's, that unmistakable shock of bone on bone. In this moment, everything that had seemed so slow and accidental became chilling and real. A man's body pressed against hers, his arms coiled around her ribcage. She began to scream, the sound scorching her throat. She bucked her legs and beat her fists against the man's thighs. She felt possessed by some savage, essential force, a fear that had its own intelligence. A second man, wearing a ski mask, appeared in the faint red glow of the taillights with a roll of duct tape. With shaking hands, he forced a rag into her mouth, his fingernails grazing her palate. Reflexively, she gagged and bit down. The man cursed and slapped her full on the cheek. She had never been hit in her life. The shock of it was so intense that at first she felt nothing, then a fiery stinging spread across her face. "Relax, man," the person holding her reprimanded. There was a disconcerted note in his voice, like he didn't expect that kind of behavior from the guy who was now stuffing the rag back into her mouth and sealing it with tape. This time, she was too stupefied to resist. As he wound more tape around her wrists, he avoided her stare, as if ashamed. Then he tied the blindfold over her eyes. Where the fuck was JF? Hadn't he heard her screaming? She felt herself pulled upright by a formidable strength. The second man took her by the ankles, and they hauled her up like a trussed pig. The terror was paralyzing, yet at the same time, a part of her was able to see what was happening, as if watching a movie. The ski masks, the duct tape, how they were opening the trunk and dropping her inside, slamming the door, pulling away with a conspicuous squealing of wheels. It was exactly like some cliched action movie, the kind she considered too dumb to watch. Since her kidnapper had bound her hands in front of her, Séverine managed to peel the tape away from her mouth and remove the gag and blindfold. A strip of tape was stuck to her hair. On top of everything, she'd probably have to cut it out. At first, she cried and shouted and kicked at the door with her one red espadrille. She must have lost its mate in the struggle. But as the car jostled along, stopping and starting and turning without warning, nausea roiled from gut to throat, and she vomited mojito. She lay tucked all the way back in the trunk, skin chafing on the coarse carpet, left cheekbone throbbing, avoiding the mess of bilious rum, trying and failing to dispel her claustrophobia. Over the next hour or so, Séverine managed to calm down and think more objectively. First, she determined this was an Fratelli job, not the Mafia. If she knew one thing about the Corsican Mafia, it was the best functioning bureaucracy on the island. To kidnap the daughter of the most powerful politician on the island, they'd hire Sardinian professionals. But these guys were amateurs, Séverine thought, as she bitted the silver tape around her wrists, not even tying them behind her back. That said, Fratelli had plenty of experience with kidnappings. Only 6 months ago, they'd taken the son of the owner of AC Ajaccio. Everyone knew the football club laundered money for Fratelli, but rumors began to circulate that the owner was skimming off the top. He paid 300,000 francs, and his son was returned the next day, after a night spent eating chips and playing Nintendo with his masked captors. But he wasn't a girl, Séverine considered with a chill. Maybe it was that new group, Novi Patriotti, who'd announced their defection from Fratelli on New Year's Day. But according to her dad, Novi Patriotti was busier messing with I Fratelli than the French government. He said most of these militants were less concerned with independence than lining their pockets with extorted money they framed as a revolutionary tax, and acting like big shots. Surely, Severine's captors would hold her in some literal pigsty for the night, call her father demanding, in their eyes, an ungodly sum of money that her family wouldn't bat an eye withdrawing, and she'd be returned by morning. Maybe she'd even get a postponement on the back. Papa would see that the police apprehended these assholes mere hours after her release. It was possible the police were already trailing them, waiting for the car to pull over so they could avoid a chase on these dark, dangerously narrow roads. Messing with the island's moneyed class was one thing, but kidnapping the prefect's daughter was another. They'd be made an example of. After what could have been 1 hour or 3, the car stopped and the engine turned off. Once they took her out of the trunk, she'd make a run for it, she decided. Heart pounding, she put the tape back over her mouth, sans gag, and retied the blindfold, positioning it so she could just see over it with one eye. The trunk leapt open with a hollow click. "Oh, Burke," a man said, recoiling from the stench of her vomit, which mortified her. He took her by the wrists and guided her out. "Swing your legs around. That's it," he said, pulling her upright. The ends of her hair were pasted to the skin of her back. It was puke, she realized, nauseated. She tentatively lowered her feet, one bare, one still wearing the red espadrille, until they touched the ground. He led her towards an idling vehicle just ahead. Its headlights scarcely penetrated the thick blackness of the night. It was so dark, she had no sense of which direction she should run with her one shoe. The air smelled of eucalyptus and thyme, no trace of salt, and it was cooler and less humid than by the coast. They must be up in the Maquis, the precipitous interior of the island, where boars ran wild. Séverine hadn't spent any time up here. It was craggy and sparsely populated, the land of the treacherous snow-capped mountains you saw from the beach. She was not an outdoorsy person, and the extremities of nature held no fascination for her. Every year, hikers were seriously injured or even died trekking the GR20 through these inhospitable mountains, and those were people who trained for their expedition. It was also wildfire season. If she ran off into this opaque darkness, she was as good as dead, she rationalized, as she reluctantly let herself be guided into the trunk of the second car. "All good?" a third person asked from the front seat, his voice thinner and younger. The trunk was not closed off from the main cab, so they must have switched from a sedan to a 4x4, she realized. After only a few minutes, the car turned and began shuddering back and forth, metal jangling violently. They had veered off paved roads and were traveling farther up into the Maquis. The men were too edgy to speak, and in any case, the 4x4's rattling was deafening. The fear she'd managed to diminish in the first car returned thicker and heavier. She was so far from her parents, and she had no idea who these men were or what they would do with her. After maybe another 20 minutes, the car stopped again. She heard the doors creak open and shut and gravel crunch underfoot. The trunk groaned as someone lifted it open, and unseasonably crisp night air rushed in. "Come on," the man who'd hit her said. Already she recognized his voice as different from the other two, his diction more precise and accent less Italianate. It was the voice of someone who hadn't spent his entire life on the island. He led her towards a cottage, dark save a slab of stone illuminated by a dingy light beside the front door. Around the house, shadowy patches of scrub and scraggly trees silhouetted black against the plum-colored sky. Entering the cottage meant resigning herself to their unknowable schemes. It meant having to wait for someone to save her. "Do I have to go inside?" she asked in a small voice, pressing her heels into the gravel. But the man only pulled her more forcefully. There was no other choice. The screen door whined open, and she was over the threshold. "She's covered in puke," said the third man, if you could call him that. He sounded like a teenage boy. "I'd actually love a shower," Séverine piped up. "Let's get something clear right now. You are not a guest. You are a prisoner of war. the man who'd hit her snapped. A prisoner of war. The pompousness, the delusion. These bored little boys ran around blowing up construction sites and shooting at each other and had the audacity to call it war. And now, Séverine was caught up in the crossfire of one of their stupid games. She's gonna stink up the whole place, argued the man who'd first grabbed her. The man who'd hit her hesitated. Make it quick, and straight to the closet afterwards. With a tentative hand hovering over her shoulder, the boy led her down a short hallway and through a door to her left. He flicked on the switch, and dim orange light filtered through her blindfold. No one's watching me shower, prisoner of war or not, she spat. Out. What if you lock yourself inside? No, Bruno would lose it. Bruno, she interrupted him. He's the one in charge? The boy said nothing, just helped her step over the ledge of the tub and closed the shower door. Séverine took off her blindfold and draped her foul clothing over the door. The frosted glass distorted the boy's features, but she could tell he was tall, easily 1.9 meters, with a bleached buzz cut and protruding ears. It was as if a child's head rested atop an ungainly man's body. He was leaning against the sink, but unable to keep still, a nervous wreck. As for the room, it was tiny, covered in outdated peach tile. To her left was the closed door. To her right, a pebble glass window the size of a pizza box. Small, but not so small she couldn't squeeze through. When she turned the taps, she noticed her hands shaking. She peed in the shower, appalling, but preferable to being monitored on the toilet. As she dragged a bar of streaked yellow soap across her sore skin, she thought how strange it was to perform such a quotidian act in this hostile place. She carefully recalled what had just happened to her. It was as if she'd somehow slipped into a parallel dimension. A part of her was certain she was simultaneously at home in her bedroom, listening to the new Cranberries tape on her boombox and combing her hair, getting ready for bed. "We won't touch you if you're scared about that," the boy said above the torrent of water. "But you did touch me. Your boss there, Bruno, is it? Hit me in the face." "He did?" the boy asked, surprised. "Well, I meant, you know." "I see," she said. This boy could not hurt her, she realized. He might help her, even, if she played it right. "What did you agree to do with me?" Someone rapped loudly at the door. "That's long enough," a man said from the other side. Not Bruno, but the one who'd grabbed her off her bike. Obediently, she shut off the water, and the boy tossed her a thin, stiff towel. "What am I supposed to wear?" she asked. He called for someone to bring her a dress or something. The bathroom door opened and closed, and the boy handed her a wash-faded navy cotton dress. It was an enormous, shapeless smock, sleeveless with gaping armholes that exposed the sides of her breasts. He had not provided any underwear. "Can you help me with something?" she asked. "What?" "I can't get this duct tape out of my hair." Okay, but you have to put the blindfold back on." "Not that one, it's all nasty," she said. "The tape's kind of on the back of my head, so you can stay behind me and I won't see you." Facing the peach tile wall, she heard the shower door clatter open and felt his fingers lift the tape, gently picking at each strand of hair. "You should have said something before you washed your hair," he admonished. "I might have to cut it out now." "How old are you?" she asked. 18, he replied. "I'll be 18 in a month," Séverine said, and they both seemed to wonder at sharing even one thing in common. The bathroom door opened, and Séverine instinctively whirled around. In the doorframe stood a hulking man in a black leather racing jacket. His dark hair buzzed like the boy's, with a thick mouth and sunken eyes and the shadow of a unibrow. She saw the boy, too. Long blonde eyelashes, a crooked nose, and his bottom lip full and wet, a baby's pout. As soon as the man saw Séverine see him, he slammed the door shut. "Why the fuck is her blindfold off?" he barked. "She was in the shower," the boy stammered. He swung around, frantically looking for the damp strip of fabric that Séverine had dropped to the floor. She crouched to pick it up and retied it herself. "It's on. I didn't see anything," she lied. The door burst open, and the man's rough hand grabbed Severine's wrist, pulled her from the humid bathroom, and pinned her against the hallway wall. A cold and heavy metal object pressed against her chest. Without ever having been in such proximity to a gun, she recognized it immediately. Its heaviness seemed more than a material property. Its awful potential burdened it with weight like a body. For the first time in her short life, she realized how delicate and uninsured her existence was. It was stupid, absurd, how impermanent she was, how this little machine could extinguish her with a twitch of a finger. What a colossal waste it would be for her exceptional future to vanish at the hand of this troll. "This is not a game," he told her with an edge of desperation, a plea. The direction of his voice turned back towards the bathroom. "You might be interested to know what prison's like, but I'm not going back because of this bullshit." "What the hell are you doing?" She heard the man who hit her, Bruno, charge down the hallway. "She saw us," the other man said. "Put the gun down, Jesus," Bruno spat. "You think we have any leverage if she's dead?" The man removed the gun from her breastbone, and she massaged the spot as if she'd been wounded just by its touch. "She's been here 10 minutes, and already you're pointing a gun at her?" Bruno yelled. "Both of you need to pull it together. They're expecting a call in 20 minutes. "My parents?" Séverine asked. "You spoken to them?" Bruno ignored her questions. "Are you hungry? Do you need to use the toilet?" "No," she said, frustrated. "Have you spoken to my parents? Do they know what happened?" "Then you'll be brought to your cell." The man in the leather jacket placed his hand between her shoulder blades, but she planted her feet. "When am I going home?" Séverine asked, steadying her voice, using the tone of the inconvenienced wealthy. "That depends on the cooperation of the occupation regime," Bruno said, "and your parents." Without further discussion, the other man led her a short way down the hallway, opened a door, and thrust her inside. Her back thumped against a wall, and the door was shut before she could object. She pulled down the blindfold and found herself surrounded by a dense blackness, much darker than inside the trunk. Before her arms fully extended, her fingers touched wood. They had stuck her in a closet, no wider than 1.5 meters. She ran her hands down the wood until they met a doorknob. It wouldn't budge. It was sweltering inside the closet, and she felt like she was in a coffin, buried underground, overwhelmed again with claustrophobia. To top it all off, the fucking tape was still tangled in her hair. The last vigilant part of her told her to cry quietly, that she should keep up the charade of strength and defiance for her dignity, but Séverine no longer cared. She wailed low, a sound that made her ears ring, and the crevices of her face and neck filled with tears. A knuckle rapped against the door. "Quiet down," the boy pleaded. "I'm suffocating in here," she wailed. "There's a fan to the right of the door. Turn the knob at the base." Whatever antiquated contraption they'd placed in the closet whirred to life like a jet engine, sweeping stayed air along her face. The closet was too small for her to stretch her legs all the way, so she propped her ankles against the wall and stared at the darkness above her. Beyond, she heard the murmurings of men. How was any of this real? How did any powers, earthly or otherwise, allow her, of all people, to find herself in this situation? How could her parents have let this happen? She couldn't help but start crying again, quietly. She folded her legs against her chest, and the moments before she'd left the house flashed before her with the haziness of last night's dream as it dissipates from memory. The safe glow from the windows, her mother's glossy magazine draped over one knee, her father's hand on her cheek.